Amazing. Thank you all for being here. It's really nice to see a crowd interested in art and printmaking. I'm honored to welcome Professor Paul Coldwell, who, if you met some of you, we had the honor to have him as a guest teacher talking to our students yesterday and today. Thank you for that. He is an esteemed artist. He's a professor at the Academy University of Arts in London. He's also a researcher and an artist who contributed to many exhibitions around the world. His art is also part of the collection of MoMA, Tate, British Museum, V&A, and many others. He's been in public conversation with artists like Jim Dine, William Kentridge, Paola Rego, and other very important artists within the art and printmaking in particular. So I would like to give a word to him and welcome him in the name of all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. Before I go any further, I must thank Tanya for the very kind invitation to come and talk with you, and also that she's been the most fantastic tour guide for Antwerp for me, and been absolutely wonderful. So many thanks. The one problem with giving a talk is when you're being introduced, because it makes you sound a bit important, but one's only as good as one's last event. So I hope that I managed to sustain your interest over the talk. Now, for some of you that I've spoken to already in the course of the last 2 days, which has been a real pleasure, I've mentioned the idea that I think that as an artist, you should develop a family of people that are particularly important to you. And so what I try to do in my teaching is I never tell anyone to do something that I'm not prepared to do myself. So I'm going to start with this talk by introducing my family. And over the years, these artists, Marcel Duchamp, Alberto Giacometti, Giorgio Morandi, Philip Guston, and Albrecht Dürer, have continually figured in my thinking and in my head. And in a way, I could imagine that if I was organizing a Guess Who Comes to Dinner, these would be my dinner guests. Now, with Marcel Duchamp, this piece, Box in a Valise, has been particularly important for me. It was made when France was occupied by the Nazis in the mid-1930s. And Duchamp wanted to keep his legacy together. And so he made reproductions of all his work. A lot of them have been made in very particular kinds of printmaking, as well as little plaster casts and things like this. And he crisscrossed Paris to organize this, disguised as a cheese merchant. And it always sort of struck me as being a rather wonderful way of disguising yourself. But also, I think that one of the things I've always found about printmaking is that it is, in the first instance, a way of making a multiple. So that, for me, one of the important things is that nobody can possess my prints. They can share with it, but there's a chance that it might pop up in all kinds of different places. So it's not like working on a unique painting or sculpture where one person could own it and determine it. With printmaking, you have this opportunity of getting into all kinds of different places. Duro, in particular, these two engravings, one of St. Jerome and the other one of Melancholia, have been incredibly important to me for the sheer mystery. I don't understand Melancholia any more than when I first looked at it, but I'm fascinated by not understanding it. And when over lockdown in London a few years ago, I constantly thought of St. Jerome in his cell, because in a way that's how I felt. I felt that I was in my studio, I was only allowed to go for a walk for half an hour, and I had to surround myself with windows into how I thought about the world. I hope it's not broken. Giacometti is also an artist that has had a huge impression on me. When I first started making sculpture, the idea of sculpture was that it was measured in weight. You know, it was steel, it was heavy, it was Mako, and all the things that I wanted to do in sculpture were the opposite. I wanted things to be delicate, intimate, and fragile. And when I discovered a piece like this, The Palace at 4 a.m., which is almost like made, I mean, it could be crushed in an instant. It's made of sticks and bits of glass. It gave me a huge confidence that there were other ways of making sculpture. And also I thought that the relationship between his prints and his drawings and his sculpture were very interesting. Once again, he's trying to make art out of very little. Giorgio Morandi is another one of those artists that's been key for me. I curated a big show in England called Morandi's Legacy on British Art, which looked at what I perceived to be the profound influence of Morandi on a whole generation of British art, from Ben Nicholson through to David Hockney. And one of the things that I find so intriguing about his work is this combination of abstraction and figuration, that images are made out of the matrix of cross-hatching, and in particular in these two images that are actually very small prints, smaller than A4. There's almost a kind of feeling that you've got to use your imagination to determine where the bottles and jugs and things like that are. And the moment you've captured them, they seem to disappear. So for me, they're incredibly magical. They are things which engage you in the act of looking. You have to work hard to look. Philip Guston, he's got a big show that's just finished in London. But I saw a huge retrospective in New York about 15 years ago, and it blew my mind. What I thought was so wonderful was that he was making art out of the kind of stuff, you know, like after a party and you've got undressed and got into bed. Philip Guston would make a painting out of all that stuff, you know, your shoes on the floor and things like that. And I loved the language of the everyday. And once again, there's a lithograph that he made towards the end of his life, and this wonderful still life, the painter's table. And so now I'll get on to some of my work. It feels a bit presumptuous to take a leap from Philip Guston's work to mine, but I hope you'll go with me. This was a set of prints I made quite early on when I was working with the computer. Now, I'm making an assumption here, but for most of you in the audience are younger than me. When I first started using the computer was so slow that if you drew a line, you had to wait 10 minutes for the line to appear. And the only ink that you could print with was dye-based inks, which would literally fade in the course of an exhibition. You know, by the time the exhibition had finished in 2 or 3 weeks, it was like a ghost. So you know, initially it was quite a struggle to find ways of working on the computer. But what I wanted to do was to integrate it with the process of with the traditional processes of printmaking that I was familiar with. So what I began doing with this series was working from photographs I took, quite basic photographs, working them in layers on the computer over a period of weeks, exploring the idea of the half-tone dot, which is really the way that a photographic image can enter printmaking. And I became very excited. So a print like this is a 4-color lithograph with then an additional embossed black lime block printed on top. Now, what I wanted to do was to explore the idea of making works which could stand on their own, but also represent a story and be a series. So in this set of 6 prints, I hope that each print works in its own right. Sorry, we haven't got a light show here. It's not my aura, I can assure you. Okay? So I want you to sort of imagine this to be a kind of like a little simple narrative about the idea of journey. So before you go on a journey, you need... okay, can we... is it settled? Okay. Right. Before you set off on a journey, you need to set your alarm and wake up, and you need a glass of water to have a rinse, and you need a destination. So there's a little postcard here of mountains somewhere you're aiming to go. You need a bag for a journey to put all your goods in. You need means of transport. Now, for example, with this print, this was made with a toy plane which I suspended from my studio by a wire, and that was photographed. I then photographed the studio floor, and then I painted my own shadow to actually connect the plane to the floor. So this has been very much kind of constructed in the studio. Here's another means of transport. You need to pack your bags and iron your shirts so you're ready for your journey. And then at the end of the journey, you hang your coat up and you've either arrived or you've forgotten something. So in a way, each of the prints, as I said, I wanted to work individually, but I also wanted you to be able to read them as a narrative. And that then made me embark on this set of 3 prints called Sights of Memory. And here what I wanted to do was to take that idea of the half-tone dot and begin to explore the idea of those dots becoming like a constellation, or like in children's books where you have dots which you join up and you make a drawing. And so here there's a relationship between the photographic image on the one hand that has been mediated into a halftone, and the hand-drawn drawing as a linear device. And what I wanted what I wanted to happen was there to be a kind of tension between the drawing and the photograph, and for the viewer to try and interpret a kind of meaning. I mean, I thought that, for a journey that you need a suitcase, and the mountains represent something that could be both for pleasure, you could be going skiing, or it could be the barrier between countries that refugees have often had to overcome. So in a way, there's an ambivalence, and Duchamp spoke about the way that he wanted the viewer to construct his pictures in their head. And in some ways what I wanted to happen was for you to be able to read the image of the suitcase, disregard that, read the mountain, and then put them together in your head, if that makes sense. This one is very dark, and it's actually very dark in the flesh, but it's an image of branches of a tree, and some of those dots have been joined up to form an envelope, as if there's a kind of message in there. And then here, perhaps the most poignant of the three is a kind of book against an image of a railway track. And, this, I hope, invokes connotations of, simple things like you're going on holiday and you're on the train and you're reading, or on the other hand, historically, the train has been used for some very sinister purposes in this century or last century. So once again, I want to kind of create an image where it hovers, it balances, and you, the viewer, tip it one way or the other. And this works also alongside lots of the sculptures I was making. This is quite a small bronze of a plane going over mountains with a little river, a mountain. And here, this is a very small, about this size, bronze, painted bronze that I made for a show at Kettle Yard in Cambridge, called Single Bed Daydreaming. And underneath it says, "This house shelters daydreaming." So, and that's cast in rubber. So it's almost as if there's a little sort of poetic association I'm trying to draw out. Now, a number of years ago, I was invited by a Japanese company of paper makers to test out some new digital Japanese paper. And they invited 6 artists across the world to try this out and see what would happen. It was the most wonderful paper, and instead of being paid a fee, I asked to be paid in paper. So I had a nice, I think also that's something else about being an artist, is one has a different material view on the world. A stack of good paper is actually worth much more than 50 quid in your bank balance. And in kind of homage to the Japanese tradition of woodcut and the floating world, what I did was I worked very intensely on these prints, initially in layers of inkjet, and then, for example, here the bouquet of flowers is a woodcut that has then been printed on top of the digital print. And what I found so interesting was the difference in the quality of ink. So it caught the light in a different way. So it was both intricated, but also a little bit different. And here's a couple more from that series. So here the suitcase has been relief printed, and here again. And these became sort of quite important works for me. What I also am very interested in is the idea of hiding things in pictures in broad daylight. And here you can see, this is a very large silkscreen, about this big, of a beach and pebbles on the beach, where I've started to manipulate some of those pebbles and give them more of a flattened form. And then hopefully you can see there's a kind of linear drawings of picture frames, as if somehow I'm trying to make an equivalent between the multitude of personalities on the beach and the idea of one's family and an expanded family. And here this was a companion piece with using branches from a tree, and once again these picture frames are embedded within the picture as if they are perhaps leaves or something that is fragile and might drop. Tanya mentioned that I've been involved a lot in research, and alongside in what I've described as kind of independent works, I've often worked with collections or museums, and I've adopted a kind of strategy by which I go into that museum or collection, research over a period of 6 months to a year, and produce an exhibition for them as a result of that work. One of the projects I did was at the Scott Polar Research Institute. Now, some of you may not know, but Captain Scott was the Englishman who tried to be the first to reach the South Pole, but was beaten by the Norwegian group. And there's a research centre at Cambridge, which is in his name, which is also involved in polar research and monitoring the ice flow and things like this. And I spent about sort of 6 months researching in their collections, both their material collection and also in their library and things like this. And one of the things that I started to get very interested in was the idea of postcards and letters being sent from Antarctica to England and back. You know, we're so used to immediate communication that you forget that a letter would be, you know, may take 6 months to get there and back. And now also, typically of Edwardian England, which Scott was part of, there was kind of a rather curious bit of bureaucracy. Now, what you've got to imagine is here is Captain Scott in a hut in the middle of Antarctica, surrounded by his crew and everyone. And he had to have official permission to be Postmaster General so that he could stamp the letters so that they could go home. And I just thought this was just so wonderfully bureaucratic. And then so in my head, I began to think of Captain Scott not only as this adventurer, but also as a bureaucrat. You know, it's gone all this way, and what is he doing? He's stamping letters. So this was. I'll just say that one of the other. This is a little sketch from my notebook at the time, and one of the things about this expedition was it happened at an incredibly kind of crucial time in terms of how England and Great Britain understood itself. On the 15th of April 1912, the Titanic sank. Now, this was a huge blow to British pride. I mean, when I say we, the British were masters of the oceans. You know, they had a huge empire, and for this flagship ship to go down on the maiden voyage was a huge dent in national pride. 6 months later, the bodies of Scott and his 5 companions were discovered in Antarctica. And less than 2 months later, 18 months later, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot, and that was the beginning of the First World War. So within a space of 2 years, there was a huge change. And also, if you imagine that the First World War was begun with cavalry charges, you know, and it ended up with the use of the tank. So the world sort of somehow changed beyond all recognition in that time. And there's Scott stamping his letters. And this was the sculpture piece, which for me is a kind of portrait of Scott. So in the middle is his shaving brush and his razor, as if, he's preparing himself and all smart. On the left is a set of clear resin cast rubber stamps that I made. And on each one, there's just one word, which is we. The next one is must reach the pole this time. 7 words, which he spoke in an interview with the Manchester Guardian before leaving England on the expedition. On the other side, there's another 7 words, which are the last words in his diary, which says, "For God's sake, look after our people," because he was aware that without him being around, his family might starve. That he wasn't sure if they would get a pension and things like that. Now, I'm sorry, hold on. Now, along with this idea, I wanted to make a series of postcards that were with words from Scott's diary that were descriptions of snow or ice. And they were made from make-up imaginary Arctic landscapes that I constructed in my studio. Cracked mud, another one made out of sugar lumps and plastic. And then these were the final postcards. And what I did was I contacted 7 postmasters or postmistresses on the route to Antarctica at stopping off points of the Terra Nova, their ship. And I asked them to put a stamp on the postcard, stamp it, and send it back to me in the post. So the postcard then took the journey to the South Pole and back that I wasn't prepared to do. It's too cold. I didn't want to do it. And I liked the idea that the postcard, as an object, carried the trace of that journey. So they were scuffed or creased and things like that. And this is how they were presented. And then the postcards respelt the message back. For God's sake, look after our people, and we must reach the pole this time. Now, but I also, and I think this will resonate with most of you, that one of the troubles with being an artist is you've got to fund your own work. That every time I do a project, I have to work out ways that I can fund what I want to do. That often implies, lengthy applications for grants and things like this. But with Scott, he did a whole series of lectures like this that he would be paid for. They had sponsorship from schools, clubs, all kinds of things, because it had captured the national imagination in a way that, for example, America was captivated by the first trip to the moon. And so every pony, every dog, every sleeping bag, every tent was sponsored by someone. And so these are 2 of a series of 6 silk screens that I did that kind of explored that idea. And in the top one, I think it's quite nice that it says, where is it? Candles, edible though not eaten. Because what you had to imagine is Antarctica, there's nothing there. The only things that they could get when they were there was snow, which they could melt for water, and the occasional seal that they could eat. Everything else had to be taken with them. There was no 9/11 shop, if you'd forgotten something. If you'd forgotten something, tough, I also made a set of bronzes, small bronzes, illustrating different parts of the story. So here is the idea of their tent in a blizzard. And I also made a hot water bottle out of blown glass with a compass on it to kind of somehow suggest both ice and the warmth that's needed. And I got very struck by the fact that this expedition became the personification of camaraderie in England, that it became known for the fact that everyone was so self-effacing, so kind to each other. And this is a set of 5 small bronzes, each with a compass pointing south, of objects that I thought people would share. A little bit like in the trenches, where, you know, chocolate and cigarettes almost became a currency. So this is a little piece like that. Another collection that I've worked with is the Freud Museum, both in Vienna and London. And here's in black and white, that's a cupboard in the vestibule of the Freud Museum in London. On the other side is the rather empty vestibule for the museum in Vienna. Now, the museum in Vienna are the apartments where Freud worked for about 30 years, and he did all his work. And he had to flee Vienna to avoid persecution. His family were threatened. He managed to pay a huge fine to the Nazis to actually get his possessions out of Vienna to London. And he basically managed to leave Vienna to what he said was to die in freedom. But he only lived in London for about a year. He had cancer of the jaw. Now, meanwhile, his apartment in Vienna was repossessed by the Nazis and ironically used as a holding place for Jews waiting to go to the concentration camps. I mean, you know, a bit sick. So in a way, the museum was cleared out. There's very little, apart from photographic evidence, of the museum in Vienna. Paradoxically, in London, there's all his stuff. There's all his objects, his famous couch, and all the rest of it. And so, but it was a place that really, he was only there for a year. And I got very interested in this idea. And very much interested in the idea of presence and absence. And I started to think about the Turin Shroud. And I mentioned it to one of the students yesterday. You know, although this is a fake, it is a very interesting proposition that this shroud carries an impression of someone. We don't know who. And in some ways it has a kind of ghostly presence. And it occurred to me that I wanted to use Freud's coat that he'd bought for his migration to London as a kind of motif, as a kind of substitute for the absent Freud. And what I did was I approached the National Gallery in London to ask them if they would X-ray the coat as if it was an old master. And this took months of negotiating. And eventually they kindly agreed on a day where I could bring the coat to the museum and it would be X-rayed. Now, sorry, I have some... I was going to look at my notes and I've forgotten to... Right. Now, one of the things about it, when it was received at the National Gallery, is it was given what's called an accession number. And that means that the government accepts that this is an object of importance and it's covered by their insurance. But for me, what it did was it reaffirmed that this coat had gone from just an ordinary coat into something of cultural importance. It was like a bit of magic, where the coat's still the same, but it's now transformed. And, you know, for the duration of when it was in the museum, I had to wear rubber gloves, latex gloves, and touch it and things like that. So here's the coat being laid out, and these are some of the X-rays on the light box. But what I also wanted to do was to kind of suggest that this X-ray was like a magical trace of Freud, in the same way that the Turin shroud is a magical trace of whoever. And finally, and probably most importantly, I wanted it to be like a metaphor for psychoanalysis itself. Psychoanalysis is the process of looking beyond surface, of layers that we have embedded within us, and by paring away at those layers to get to truths or wounds or whatever. And so I thought that if I was lucky, I might be able to achieve those things. And here you can see me next to, this was a full-size print of a composite of all the X-rays laid out. And on the other side, I thought that since this was now an object of cultural importance, it should have its own travelling case, as if it was a relic. So this is a kind of cage which opens and accommodates the coat hanging on a coat hanger. Now the other thing is, for example here, this is the desk, Freud's desk, with what he called his old and grubby gods. These are all the statues of various gods and spirits that he would look through to his patient on the sofa. So they for me, they were like a kind of filter. And what I wanted to do was the fact that the Freud Museum in Vienna had nothing. I wanted to return this desk to them as a ghost. So I worked with an assistant, and over a period of a week, we 3D scanned every object on his desk. And then we had them printed in white nylon, 2/3 life size. And we did that so that there was a kind of sense of perspective, as if you were looking back. And then these are arranged then as they would have been on his desk. And this was shown in the museum in Vienna, in the place where the desk would have been. And here's the side table as well. So in some ways it was like a remembrance of what had been lost, a ghost. These files were also used to make this large inkjet print, where I've sort of laid out all the objects in a kind of different way, as if they're like an inventory of objects. And these are two relief prints printed using laser-cut wood blocks. One of a bouquet of flowers, another of a suitcase. And I wanted, once again, this idea of whether they are appearing or disappearing. And the idea of the uncanny, where something is both obvious but also a little bit odd. I made an overnight bag for Freud, including one of his gods in there and a clean shirt and things like that. And once again, the idea was about travelling back to Vienna as well. And then part of this whole project around Freud was involved around the debate around Brexit. You don't want to know what happened in England over Great Britain over Brexit. It's, for me, it's a shameful moment of our history. But while I was in Vienna, I worked with a group of of secondary school kids who were all refugees, from refugee families. And I asked them each to bring in an object that was precious to them, not valuable, but precious. And they all brought in different things. One person brought in a pair of their sports shoes, another a little bracelet, and things like this. Things of very little consequence except the fact of personal connection. And I made postcards adding those to one of Freud's objects as well. And then we did a performance in Sigmund Freud Park in Vienna, where we attached 100 of these postcards to helium balloons with a note in each saying, if these were found, please return them, and they had my address, and I will send you a gift in return. They were all launched, and it was a miraculous day because it had been overcast and raining all week, and then you see this wonderful blue sky. It was like, you know, some days you know that someone's working with you, and this was one of those. Only 2 postcards were returned, and in the exhibition I made a letter rack that could accommodate 100, and there were only 2. And I wanted to somehow highlight the fact that in spite of all this rhetoric against migrants, you know, where people were accusing people of just trying to come to England for financial gain and all the rest of it, I wanted to highlight the struggle and the risk taken in migration. Another piece that I made, also connected to postcards, was taking the titles of popular songs. Things like I Can't Stop, I'm not going to sing these, I assure you. You know, Trains and Boats and Planes, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow, I Can't Get No Satisfaction. And these were sort of printed along with the images. And in a way, once again, I was sort of trying to sort of touch at the way that in popular songs, they embed truths. You know, I mean, often it's a way that we try and understand our feelings. It's through popular songs. So that's that. Okay, so then back to some more independent work. What am I doing for time? God. I'll try and rattle on a bit quicker. These are a set of photo etchings where often what I do is arrange things in the studio, take loads of photographs, and then start manipulating them, playing with them on the computer. And in this set called Passing Thoughts, I wanted to then superimpose another image as if it had floated onto the first, both disrupting the first, but also adding another meaning. And here you have a photograph of a pair of shoes, a mountain range in contrast to the kind of domestic scene below, a suitcase perhaps suggesting travel against. These were all objects. I went shopping, brought them home, painted everything white, and then photographed it. And here, a shadow of a bomber over picture frames. And I just want to sort of set up poetic associations that you might explore. Another project was at the Sir John Soane Museum in London. Now, let me just... The Sir John Soane Museum was the house of Sir John Soane, who was one of the greatest living architects. And it was built 2 centuries ago. And it was the place where he created a huge collection. He wanted something like a personal version of the British Museum. So there's things like Egyptian sarcophaguses, There's a huge collection of drawings. There's Hogarth's Rake's Progress there, Canaletto, wonderful collection of stuff. And it was also a place where he taught his students, so there were loads of architectural models and things like that. Now, I started sort of working in this collection, and it began to occur to me that if I'd been born 2 centuries ago, I would have been below stairs. I would have been not the cook, I would probably be the cleaner or the lackey or whatever. And I started to think of the house from the viewpoint of the servants and the chefs and the cooks that were below stairs. And I tried to imagine what it must have been like to be in this house which is full of creativity, but where they are just doing deadpan chores all the time. So I began to make work as if the domestics had been responding to the museum itself and using whatever they had at hand. And I thought, well, the most important thing they would have would be foodstuffs. So they might start thinking through that. And this is from a whole set of ceramic plates that I made with a kind of decorative pattern that is taken from Spode. And then in the centre, architectural devices or forms that have been made out of sugar lumps. And then these are architectural models made out of pasta, scrubbing brushes, sugar lumps again. The one, Ghost Arch, has been 3D scanned and then printed. Here's a ruin, once again made from sugar lumps, scrubbing brush, cotton reel. They're kind of very, very playful. And these also led to a kind of series of laser-cut woodcuts, where, once again, the starting point were photographs of architectural models that I'd made in the studio. I have to say that most of my work is predicated on the idea of play. And I think as artists, we are incredibly privileged that we keep that connection that we have with play that we had in childhood. When I think about it, I do the same things that I probably did when I was 2 or 3. I pile things up to see till they fall over. I mess things around. I imagine that something is something else. And I think that is so important for our culture, because I think that play is the most wonderful state to actually discover things. And so, I'd encourage you all to really value experimentation and play. Here's another one from that series of woodcuts. And here is another. And to give you a flavour, this is the model room at the Sir John Soane Museum, which is sort of full of these cork models, plaster models, wall to ceiling is covered in stuff. And in my installation in the kitchens, I tried to echo this central organisation. And you can see here, and there you can see the dresser full of ceramic plates that I made, the sculptures in the middle, one of the prints hanging up on an easel. And there was also a film that I made of me making things out of vegetables. Didn't get an Oscar, but it should have done, for Best Vegetable Video of the Year, I think. These are some fairly recent laser-cut woodcuts. Here, once again, exploring that relationship that I mentioned much earlier on between linear drawing and the space that occupies, and the 3D space of the photograph. But I also want the drawing to be very much on the surface, as if it's kind of cutting itself through the surface. So here there's a kind of mirror. Here there's the remains of a bunch of grapes. But I began to sort of think of the grapes almost like as a river that's meandering and pushing its way through the surface of the picture, contradicting it. And here's another one with leaves and a branch. Here, you know, I wanted the branch to almost reach out to each of the picture frames as if it's trying to make kind of connections, in a way almost like a kind of family tree. Now, as I mentioned earlier about lockdown, for me lockdown was actually a very exhilarating, if not scary, experience. I found that I began to think that I was living in a Dikiriko world where no one was around and there were long shadows and things like that. And I found it an incredibly creative time initially. And I started making a whole load of small fine plaster pieces that were really still lives, echoing back to Giorgio Morandi and using a very small repertoire of objects. In each of them there's an asthma inhaler as a kind of reference to the fact that COVID attacked the lungs, and as being asthmatic myself, I thought I'm very likely to go down with something. And here's another one. So these are all quite small, and these are a combination of cast objects that found and made objects, so the little chair I've made and things like that. And it's on a builder's palette as if it could be taken away and installed somewhere else. And here's another one which perhaps has a kind of greater resonance with Dikiriko, with the clock, the alarm clock set, and 4 o'clock is the time in the morning that most people have troubled sleep, so I'm told. And these ideas also informed a set of photo etchings called The Studio, where I almost like gathered these objects together as if I began to imagine that these were a kind of family and I was doing a group photograph, you know, that there are sort of, you know, differences and similarities. Here's another one with a balloon that I added to the whole thing, as if to suggest air and breathing. Here's another one with this one almost becomes, you know, quite theatrical, and then another one there. And I boxed these together for a show I had with Giorgio Morandi, and along with that I published a whole series of poems that actually went with it. And if you're happy, I'll read one of them, which I think kind of connects. So this box it had, I think, 10 photographs and 13 poems. And the idea was that everything was printed on its own sheet and that you could arrange it yourself. And in some ways, this poem connects with what I said right at the very beginning about having a family of friends around you. And what I suppose what I felt was very heightened in lockdown was the fact that one was thrown back on one's own devices. So this is called In the Company of Friends. I'm caught in the comfort of these furnished rooms, in the company of friends, some long since dead, some now unrecognisable, old and grey, and lovers whose promises and kisses never fade away. Gathered here today at my pleasure, sitting as jury to my lonely endeavour. They assemble, pose as if for posterity like a family group, face towards me. Some sit, some stand, fixed in an instant, hands trapped in laps or on their sides, or raising a glass, whisper a brief aside. Some smoke, some drink, or talk, muttering something indistinct, comment on the weather, or recall how long it is since we last met. And poetry, is poetry just too refined to look into the soul of mankind? A pat on the back, a captured smile, an embrace, a hug, while all the while they watch and judge, as slowly working away, I tried to shape something from this human clay. On the radio, music plays, a remembered song from earlier days, mingles as the conversation moves along, mixed with talks of dreams and aspirations, accompanied by looks of wonder or consternation. Then, but slowly, as if becoming a dream, imperceptibly, my guests began to take their leave. Quiet exits, head bowed, shuffling souls, with familiar excuses, to catch the last bus home, to be back in time to feed the cat, or another appointment made that must be kept. Some too drunk for a proper farewell, and some say on parting, well, see you soon, another time, another room, good luck, my friend, and leave, their glass still warm. The room empties. The temperature falls, a final guest left, the sound of the door closing in the hall, a silence descends, enveloping all. I'm captured, trapped, now all alone, once strong, secure as part of a pack, now feeling frail, all those friendships now to no avail. As teachers and sages, their work now done, they wish their best, they're gone, now left, as evening slides inevitably into night, and I join the company of the dispossessed. Like a journeyman captured on camera, tools in hand, going door to door with no predetermined plan. Now, no other exit left in sight. Imprisoned in this empty room, I take from my pocket a word just found, or a line left discarded on the ground. And with these frailest of things, these fragments, like of dust caught in the wind, attempt to bind them to another, and then another to coalesce, and form a shape or meaning, to momentarily escape and outmaneuver death. I do have my cheerier side, I assure you. And then just to finish, in a way this talk all began with the invitation to show my work as part of Onboard last year. And there's something absolutely wonderful about seeing the work in the city of Antwerp and how hopefully it made some kind of impression. It's a final woodcut with chain and still life. And these are some of my current projects. My most immediate one is that I've been commissioned to write a big book on woodcut from my perspective. So I'm having to write 5,000 words a month at the moment and keep going. So thank you so much for listening, and I'd really welcome any questions. Thank you, you're very kind.
What were the gifts you sent back to the people who returned the 2 postcards?
I made a package of all the students' postcards in a little wallet, and I sent them that. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, to me it feels like if you, especially your objects,
Yeah.
you kind of you make present, which is like things that are often very hidden, like the the underneath the house, the people who work there, or and at the same time your prints often have like a halftone raster, which works as a kind of a veil.
Yeah.
Or is am I correct in interpreting it like this?
With the halftone dot, I suppose in printmaking, you know, in order to get from a photograph to a print, the image goes through a process. You know, when you look at newspaper photographs, you'll see that they are composed of sort of dots. So it goes from one reality to another. And what that halftone dot does as well is it reasserts the surface. You know, that printmaking is all about ink on surface. And so I try and play with that in a way. I don't try to make my sculptures like my prints. Often I will make sculptures that then become prints, get photographed and then worked into it and things like that. But the other thing is that I want to work with objects that are kind of very ordinary. I want to make art out of stuff that's very unspectacular. To kind of, I suppose, do you know the plays of Samuel Beckett, like Waiting for Godot, you know, where virtually nothing happens, but it's one of the most wonderful plays ever written. It's about our existence, you know, and most of our lives is composed of waiting around for, you know. I often think that if you assemble all the significant moments in your life, it probably adds up to 5 minutes. You know, the rest is either anticipating, reflecting, or regretting. You know.
Dear Paul, thank you for the speech already. I have a question. You were talking in the beginning of your talk. You were referring to the multiple.
Yeah.
Now, in which way is this important for you? Because I see your images, I see the language that you are putting there with the dots, with that special thing. So why is it important for you to multiply this?
Very good question. I like the fact that there's something very democratic for me about the multiple. The fact that one person can't own the image. And that also it gives me the opportunity of sending the work out into various places. Whereas if it's a unique work, you take, you know, a lot of risk and things like that. So it's basically that. I've always loved things that are printed as well, you know, and printing is all about producing a multiple. You go through a kind of process, and the benefit is that you can print 10 of those. So that's what interests me.
But in a day nowadays, and I think that's a question for the students as well. Nowadays, you have social media, you have the possibility to scan, to print, to multiply in a very different way.
Yeah.
Why is it your choice to do it in this way?
God, these are good questions. Because I have complete control. I don't do social media. I've got enough problems. But when you make a print, you tie it to specific dimensions, and it also has a physicality. I mean, in a way, there's a paradox here, because I've just done a slideshow showing reproductions of all my prints, you know, which is very different to seeing the things in the flesh. I think when you see the work in the flesh, they have quite a strong physical presence. The surface has, you know, I mean, for example, the recent woodcuts I've been doing, they're printed in an etching press, so they're both the surface printed but also embossed down. it's important for me that the work has a specific dimension, because that enables me to negotiate how emotionally I want the audience to respond to them. One of the things about if you're just working purely digitally is that you can make something poster size or postcard or, postcard size. As long as your resolution is sufficiently great. But for me, there's something about every image that should have a specific dimension, because that enables me to slightly control the viewer. I want to entice the viewer to come close and then back off and find a kind of viewing distance and establish a relationship with the work. But each generation has, different possibilities, and I'm sure that there's, lots of work. I mean, we saw a most amazing show at the Museum of Modern Art today with who was the big landscapes, which was sort of, totally conceived in a digital way and was absolutely extraordinary. But I suppose one's got to somehow be true to one's nature. And I come from a very long... My father was a printer. He was an apprentice. My younger brother printed newspapers. And I've done... So I was brought up with printed stuff, to draw on the back of, and things like that. So I think it's in my DNA.
May I comment on this answer?
Yeah.
Also about multiplicity of images and social media and the digital. I think makes me think it's very nice as perspective you were mentioning of multiplicity in images and in printmaking as a democratic process that can reach many corners. But the difference for social media and the digital, I think, makes me think the importance of something made with your own hands, something that it has this physicality, but something made out with your own hands has an aura to it, right? It has some sort of almost anima of yourself. And it reminds me of, I don't remember who was commenting about how these digital reproductions can be more of a simulacra of things.
No, I agree, but I would use the word specificity. For example, when I'm making, with the sculptures, I often remake them 4 or 5 times until I get the scale right. And I get the scale right by the relationship of my body to the object. The size isn't arbitrary. When I start with all my work, things start off very vague and then gradually become more and more specific and honed down. And that's then when I find that they have an emotional hit. Until then, they're just works in progress.
Yes, and that's the power of doing something with your hands than, just reproducing it without any sort of intervention of your own physicality. I don't know.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask because, as Peter and you've mentioned that printmaking is a very manual, physical thing, and it seems that you're very interested in using technology in the production of your prints, but not in the sharing of them, that you want them to have that aura and that. And I wonder where that interest comes from with the laser cuts and with the 3D printing and the X-rays and everything.
I suppose I'm not really actually that technically savvy. Actually, most of what I do is quite simple. When I first started using the computer, a very nice technician kept telling me, well, you can do this and you can do that and you can do that. And I eventually said, look, all I want to know to start off with is how I draw a line, how I get rid of it, and how I redraw it. You know, that's enough. Most of my work is actually quite simple. I'm not, although when I talk about it, it may sound more technically advanced, but in the end, it's it's quite simple and direct. And I'm not very good with the computer and social media, and I find emails and all the rest of it bad enough, you know, let alone anything else.
I mean, I totally understand the disinterest in technology and the social media and everything. I'm just, well, we have Elia as well, who's doing laser cutting, if that's what the name is. But I'm just interested where you got the hang of, because when I went into printmaking, it was, well, the cutting and the technique and the everything, and just to radically switch to, I'm gonna make all of my prints with technology and then spread them physically. It's an interesting switch to make.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you one thing, you know, which is why I think that research and finding out is really important. When I was a student at college, and I first found out about Giorgio Morandi's prints, I thought that they were really complicated, and my tutor inferred that, you know, he spent ages, you know, redrawing, doing more cross-hatching, that these were weeks of work in the studio. And then I actually did some research and discovered that his prints were all drawn in one go, and then what he would do is he would do a test plate. He would find out exactly how long the line would stay distinct rather than cracking up. So it was almost like a photographer, you know, working where you do a test strip to find your right exposure. And then he would just put it in the acid once and then print it. And this was a revelation to me, you know, because I'm slightly lazy by nature. And if you can find a way of getting your results going from A to B as quickly as possible, then why faff about, you know? And it changed my life,
First and foremost, thank you for showing.
Pleasure.
My question is, you showed your nylon prints. Are they to you a sculpture, a print, or a combination of both? And where is the limit of printing?
Sorry?
You showed your nylon prints, the powder prints.
Oh, the 3D prints.
The 3D prints.
Yeah.
So do you see them yourself as a print, as a sculpture, or a combination of both? And where is the limit in printing?
I saw them as the most straightforward way of achieving what I wanted. I didn't really think about them as whether they should be labelled as print or sculpture or what. They were a solution to a problem. And there are no limits to print. And, you know, I mean, I barely scratched the surface. You know, when you look at, say, for example, what Frank Stella has been doing in his, you know, 3D cutout prints and things like that, and there are, I mean, the important thing is what you're trying to say with the print, you know, and what is the purpose for you? All the kind of definitions and things like that can look after themselves, I think, you know.
Thank you.
Thank you. One of my victims.
Well, I wanted to ask, what is for you the difference between when you choose to do a print in woodcut or silkscreen or etching or lithography?
Yeah. It's in a way quite intuitive. Sometimes it's practical. You know, if if there's an opportunity to use a particular studio in a certain way, then I will use it. But in a way, once I then decide that I'm going to use that material, then it's a matter of engaging. But as I said, it's often kind of quite arbitrary. Yeah. Sorry, that's not a brilliant answer, is it? It's the best I can do at the moment, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I think you probably all need to go out and party now. I'd like to thank you so much for listening. Thank you.